We interrupt this incredibly awesome music to bring you some incredibly awesome political talk on Damn Radio.
That's correct. Hello, good morning, welcome. I'm Samuel Trapp. This is International Flavor. You're listening to Damn Radio this morning. Damn glad to have you. If you feel like phoning in, please do so. 573-746-8020. I may even answer the phone if I feel like it. And then again, I may not. Feel free to email me should you feel the urge. Live at damnradio.com. Samuel T at internationalflavor.com would be a good addresses for me. There's several others. We'll go into those another day. Tell you what, does anybody else ever get the feeling that there's like the familiar explanations just no longer work? You know, that all of the crap they've been slinging for years, all the propaganda being pumped down our throats, just they're down our ears, I suppose, coming out of their throats, just isn't working anymore. You know, all these globalist propagandist a-holes that are sending crap our way just are failing, and I like that it's failing, that people aren't paying attention to propaganda as much. And you know, I tell you what, the familiar explanations that you know, the world order, rules-based order of the Clinton years, you know, and all of that, just is just total crap. And everybody sees it, and it's like, unfortunately, those who live it are generally the ones that see it last. You know, we've been living it, and it took us a little longer because we're the good guys, aren't we? Yeah, that's right. Events now explain themselves, you know, more poorly than the context in which they actually occur. And so this is why. So, and I say this because this is why it was important to me. On Friday, a 4.5 hour annual presentation, if you will, and press conference and question and answer live in Russia, put on with Vladimir Putin, a 4.5 hour annual press conference. And so regardless of whatever your attitude is towards him, I mean, I like him, dislike him, I don't care. I'm neutral. I don't give a crap. You know, he is a masterful politician. He's been at it for a long time. He's a former KGB guy. You know, there's all kinds of stuff you could say. And but he's an effective leader. And this 4.5 hour press conference was nothing but proof of that. And so this is, you know, regardless of what you think about it, this is more than just an annual political event. It's like, it just shows the symptoms of the deeper shifts in the world. It's like a transformation of the very model of power, responsibility, and historic memory, because this guy always talks from the point of view of the past and where we came from and how we got here and why. And he sometimes over explains, you know, in how he does it. But I tell you what, it would be nice if we had anybody that would do that. And I got to tell you, you know, Trump is probably the closest in my lifetime to getting something similar, you know, where he's not afraid to answer questions. He doesn't have a playbook. Well, he might, but I mean, you know, I'm sure they both have thought about their answers and what they're going to say if someone questions this, but they're not afraid to sit and just answer questions. They don't have to read it off a prompter. They don't have to get talking points from somebody. That's how you know they're speaking. At least they believe what they're saying, right? So this wasn't like a triumph performance or anything like that. It was no exercise in justifying moves that have been done. It wasn't anything like that. It was a public administration of crisis for real, and it was like a rare phenomenon in age of tiny, short, 15-minute press briefings that they leave early from, and they got a note card to follow, and that's it. And that doesn't happen with Putin anyway. And you can say all the same sorts of things, negative if you want to, about Lukashenko from Belarus. But he's the same way. I've watched press conferences with that guy where he'll sit and talk for hours at a time and take all kinds of questions, Western questions, friendly questions, non-friendly questions, antagonistic questions. And he has no problem answering any of them. And Putin is the same way. And this was not... no carefully screened questions here. I'm sure there were some prepped. I mean, especially in the beginning, there were some prepped ones. But the key difference between the Russian president and I won't call it let's call it Western elitist political discourse in recent years, isn't in the tone, but in the method. So, like Lukashenko, like Putin, they consistently turn to the chronology, the 80s, German reunification, security assurances, Minsk agreements, Istanbul negotiations and failure, and an attack against them by people like Boris Johnson. So it's not an appeal to emotion. It's a legal and historical, logical chronology, right? And here's where the paradox comes in. In the West, such references are often dismissed as excuses. In reality, they serve a different function, in my opinion. They challenge the central, belief structure of the prevailing Western narrative that the conflict began suddenly. It began with no cause, this unprovoked that constantly you hear in the West, this unprovoked attack by Russia. It's nonsense. Economist Jeffrey Sachs, very far removed from the Russian government, has long pointed to the documented assurances given to the Soviet Union and later to Russia that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward. These assurances were repeated by multiple Western officials. This was Bush 1. This was the Germans before reunification promised that they would do this. They were never formalized in a treaty form. And therein lies the historical trap. They exist within a framework of trust, mutual trust, which was gradually replaced by a logic of, if there's no paper, if we didn't agree, we don't have any obligation, right? And so one defining feature of the current moment is that the West increasingly denies not merely the interpretations of the past, but the existence of past commitments themselves. Nobody said that. We didn't put it on paper. So the shift from debate to erasure of history is a qualitative change. History ceases to be a field of argument and becomes, some kind of an object of editorial revisionism, right? You get to revise everything. That didn't happen. And against this and all you got to do is go back and listen to it, go watch it, go find it. You can find it anywhere these days. Against this backdrop, when I also watched, as usual, once a week, I try to watch Vladimir Solovyov, and it was critical, highly. Sharp, emotionally charged. It's a different role. It wasn't explanatory. It's accusatory. He doesn't argue whether promises were broken. He says the West no longer even pretends those promises existed. In his framework, this isn't an error, but a deliberate strategy. The removal of moral responsibility through institutionalized forgetfulness, right? The second critical line of analysis is economic, right? Notably, the economic portion of Putin's press conference was, pretty boring, right? It was. I listened to it. But, it's no triumph. People were quizzing him. Well, when are there going to be roads that go all the way across, a highway that goes all the way across Russia? That's difficult. That I can't imagine how. I mean, that's and they have regional roads and stuff like that, but no huge highway system all the way across, right? And so there was detailed discussion of deficits, inflation, reserves, debt, legal procedures, that kind of thing. So that the very fact that it was so boring is probably its most powerful feature against the backdrop of European panic over trying to find $90 billion in aid for Ukraine, and all they wanted to do was steal it from Russia. The legal maneuvering around stealing that money and the fear of setting a horrible precedent has them running scared, of course. The Russian position of life in general was pretty systematic. The key issue is not numbers, but trust. Any attempt to legitimize confiscation of sovereign money undermines the architecture of the global financial system itself. This is understood not only in Moscow, but in Riyadh, Beijing, Brasilia. Europe's hesitation isn't a moral hesitation, it's structural. Their concern is not Ukraine alone, but what comes after that. And Putin noted this, and he said, once such a process begins, it won't be contained. And that argument, resonates far beyond today's battlefield, right? A crucial element of this press conference was the human dimension that he brought in. So one of the first things he did was he had a young lieutenant, I think he was, that participated in Pokrovsk, which is I can't remember, Krasnoarmeysk, I think, is what they call it, but it doesn't matter. Pokrovsk is what they call it, what it is here. And so he was presented with no staging. I mean, he was scared to death, standing up there talking, just a young soldier. He had no theater. He was a symbolic function. It demonstrated not a cult of war, but a transfer of responsibility. Soldiers to the state and then back again. You know what I mean? Western politics appeals to values. We always talk about values, but no accountability, right? The Russian model, you could call it controversial if you like, but it presented something different here. The state assumed obligations to families, to veterans, to demographic policy, to education, to all these things, right, that they talked about. It's certainly far from perfect, but it does show like a chain of command of how vertical the responsibility line goes. And while Europe is debating rules it no longer believes in, and the United States is absorbed in morals, over here we fight about right and left, the global South is watching, and I'm telling you they're watching attentively. China in Latin America, which is happening, doesn't lecture about values to everybody else. It doesn't say we're going to change your regime, we're going to do this. It's building ports, it's building railways, it's building energy infrastructure. Africa, Asia, and the Middle East are all watching how the West treats other people's assets, other people's contracts, and commitments to other people in their own region. So in this context, Ukraine becomes not the center of the world, but a consuming focal point. Not because it lacks importance, but because if you get everybody to fixate on this one all-important conflict, you can obscure all this broader crap that's going on in the world. It is quite telling that Putin did not emphasize multipolarity during this press conference. He did not announce it. He acted and spoke as if it already existed. Budget discipline, infrastructure planning, scientific investment, demographic strategy. This is the language of a long game. He's playing the long game. This isn't emergency management. And so the central question that remains after all these speeches that we heard over the weekend on stealing money versus not stealing money, what are we going to do? How are we going to do it? How do we punish Russia? How do we promote Ukraine? How do we save the globalist elite that was? How do we save them? And listening to Putin talk about these and all these, but it's not about who's right. It's something, to me, a little more obvious and maybe even more unsettling. Why are some leaders willing to answer uncomfortable questions? I mean, this was not all comfort. This wasn't all staged. Uncomfortable questions for hours while others avoid them entirely. It's possible, we're entering an era in which systems are going to be judged not by what ideology they belong to, but by their capacity to explain themselves to their own societies and then to the world, where explanation, is replaced by slogans like we do. There is no trust. Trust is gone. Where memory survives, an agency, a responsibility to your I want to keep saying Russian, to your heirs, to the people who take over after you. They need to be, that's important. You have an agency to those people. You have a responsibility to build something better than when you left it. And the world's changing. It may be, quiet, might be loud, could be uneven, but it's changing and it's irreversible. And the defining conflict of our time isn't geopolitical, but civilizational. So memory versus amnesia, administration versus propaganda and rhetoric, responsibility versus abandonment of responsibility. So for me, in that sense, a 4.5 hour conversation, it's not an answer. It's a diagnosis of what the problem really is and, what needs to happen to combat what's going on in the world. I mean, seriously, it needs to be discussed more. And I wanted to walk through this, the Putin thing, because I'm telling you that it was an interesting dialogue for sure. And I doubt it's out there translated into English. And over here, you won't hear anything. I tried to find it. What do you find? You don't find anything. And there is nothing about this 4-hour conversation. It's not there. And I tell you what, it was interesting to watch. And there was like a 5-minute deal in the beginning, and the excitement in the room. There were so many people of so many different ages, young, old, in between, journalists, not journalists, people from wherever. I don't know how they get tickets to it. You got me. How you get into that room. I assume it's something pretty unique and special to get in there. And there was a guy who was talking about it. He's, man, I'm just glad to be here, and I hope I get to ask a question. It's live on TV. They have a phone in number. You can call in and ask questions, and you can have you have questions that were presented earlier, that you emailed in, and so there's like a ton of these questions, right, coming in. And so when they introduced him, the moderator says, it's like, we're accepting questions until the end of the broadcast. And the broadcast was 4.5 hours. And it said you can call in, and they gave a phone number. You can send an SMS, and it gave another number. You can submit a question through Vkontakte and Odnoklassniki, which is Odnoklassniki is like Facebook, and Vkontakte is like contacts, like a LinkedIn, more or less. Or you can do the website, moscowputin.ru, or the chat bot in Max Messenger, which is used for the first time this year. They had a little chat bot. The total number of questions presented exceeded 2.5 million as of the moment of the broadcast when it was starting. And so there was, what they did was they broke it into 5 or 6 different topics. And I'm gonna cover some of these because nobody says what he tells his people. You never get a translation. And so she says at the beginning, Vladimir Vladimirovich, a huge number of questions concern social policy. But first and foremost are questions of war and peace. You have repeatedly said that we are ready for peace. At the same time, we are satisfied with the dynamics on the front. So what is it? War or peace? By what path will we achieve the goals of the special military operation, and what is happening on the negotiation track, given President Zelensky's statement in Berlin over the weekend that Ukraine is not prepared to discuss giving up any territory. And Putin says, at this point, we truly do not see any readiness from Zelensky. Let me remind everyone how all of this began. It began with the coup d'etat in Ukraine in 2014 and with the deception surrounding the possibility of resolving all problems peacefully through the Minsk agreements. And he's talking about the lies that were admitted later that said Minsk agreements, Minsk 1 and Minsk 2, were only a chance to give Ukraine a chance to arm themselves and build their army and get more Western weapons in and stuff like that. And so in 2022, when the situation reached a crisis, when Kiev unleashed war in southeastern Ukraine, we told them plainly that we will be forced to recognize these unrecognized republics because these referenda had been done in Donbass years ago. And Russia kept saying, look, the referenda is there. Let them at least pick their own governors. You remember me telling you that story, right? And they kept saying, look, let them do what you said you were going to let them do. Honor Minsk 1 and Minsk 2, or we will be forced to recognize them and do something. And it would be better if you simply allowed people to live peacefully as they wish, without coups, without Russophobia, and so on. This is his words. Simply withdraw your troops, and that would be it. But they refused. And after negotiations in Istanbul, they initially agreed. They had initialed the agreements and then discarded them, just threw them in the trash. Now, they again refused to end this conflict through peaceful means. Nevertheless, and I want to be precise here, we do see, we feel, and we know the signals, including from the Kiev regime, indicating a readiness for some form of dialogue. The only thing I want to emphasize is this. We have always said that we are ready and willing to conclude this conflict peacefully on the basis of the principles I outlined last June, and only after eliminating the root causes that led to the crisis. And they've been pretty clear on that. And here he was again, clear. And then she says, well, what about the situation on the front? Vladimir Vladimirovich, the situation on the front changes every day. We know that you keep your finger on the pulse, personally communicate with commanders, with our fighters, with heroes. How do you assess the situation as of today? And he says, just recently, I heard another report. Remember me telling you about that? He was had another report from the general staff last week. And what could be said overall? Immediately after our troops expelled the enemy from the Kursk region, the strategic initiative fully and completely passed into the hands of the Russian armed forces. And the initiative has been with them ever since. And what does this mean? It means that our troops are advancing along the entire line of contact, somewhere faster, somewhere slower, but in all directions, the enemy is retreating. So, and then they got into, some of the battlefield discussions on some of the things that came out. And in Seversk, when they were talking about Seversk, Putin said, after our forces expelled the enemy from Kursk, the general staff commander were reported about the capture of Seversk. And this is an important settlement. And like I told you before, because from here, opportunities open up for movement toward one of the main fortified areas, toward Slavyansk. And to the south, our units are operating that. I really don't want to go too far into this because it doesn't matter. The agglomeration also includes Konstantinivka, and the wider operational picture, very important, is Krasnoarmeysk. That's Pokrovsk. because it opens a significant operational opportunities. And then to the northeast lies Dmitrov, which is an important staging area, and 50% of the city's in there. And then he talked about Zaporizhia, Kharkov, and Sumy. And so the Sumy one I was telling you about last week, and he spent a little bit of time on it too, because what Syrski had to do was he pulled people from the Sumy region and sent them down to create something so that there would be some propaganda to sling out about down in Pokrovsk, because they wanted to use it to attack, and they kept, and then they pulled some and sent them off to the east into Seversk, and so Russia kicked further into Sumy region. And so they're getting their butts handed to them over there, and nobody ever talks about it. So the city of Volchansk has been taken, and that's in Sumy. And in Kharkov, Kupiansk is under the control several weeks ago. And he talked about all of this. He said that there's there's still people encircled over there, right? And then the moderator wanted to talk specifically about Seversk. And the reason, I don't want to say it was staged, but it probably was at least, teed up, you know what I mean? Because this is the one where Zelensky, made a fake video, and people want to call him on it. And he said, you may have seen the reports from the general staff, the grouping commander, and the brigade commanders who fought there. I asked him at the time, how do you assess the situation in Seversk? Do you control the city? And he said, we are already advancing westward. My brigade has moved 1.5 to 2 kilometers west. So the advance is continuing. You may remember the moment the storm group reported live from inside Seversk. At the end, I asked if they were changing their positions quickly. And yesterday, at a Ministry of Defense meeting, we awarded the fighters who participated in the liberation of Seversk. And after that, I invited one of the commanders. And this is where he invited this lieutenant, Naran Alexeyevich, to give him a microphone. The guy he appeared scared. He was scared. Let's put it that way. And the moderator, when he stands up, he goes, and Putin let him speak for a little while, and he didn't interrupt him, didn't say anything. He did. He said, we saw you in a video link wearing a helmet, but we haven't been formally introduced. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, how long you've been in the operation, how you got started? He said, I'm from Kalmykia. I started as a simple soldier, first as a driver. I worked my way up from an assault trooper to the commander of an assault company. And Putin says to him, Naran Alexeyevich is being modest. He began as a driver, and now he commands an assault company with more than 80 men under his command. He's a hero of the Russian Federation, and deservedly so. And he said, tell us what you can about the operation to liberate. How did it come about? He said the most difficult part was reaching Seversk without being detected. The terrain is open and very few natural shelters, so we made the decision to go in small groups covertly. And the task was completed. We assembled there without being detected, waited our orders, and launched an assault. And he said, this is the interesting part, were there still civilians in the city? He said, yes, they had lived for a long time in constant fear. When we began communicating with civilians after liberating the sector, we learned that as Ukrainian forces withdrew, they were shooting civilians who refused to leave with them. And the moderator said, unarmed civilians? And he said, yes, especially young men aged 30 to 40. They were taken out and executed. And the moderator says, so how did the people react when you entered the city? He said they were living in difficult physical and psychological conditions, and when they saw us, they were happy. They listened to Russian radio and were waiting. How many people are under your command, and what were your losses? He said, my assault group has 157 men. During the storming of the city, 84 men were involved. Our losses were minimal, 4 men during the assault. And they said, thank you, and let him go on. So they let that guy speak for a little while, and staged, not staged, who the hell can tell, but it appeared that the guy was scared to death, you know what I mean? And he was pretty young lieutenant type, and, he presented himself fairly well for not being scared. And then they talked about last week, Zelensky recorded a video near the city sign of Kupiansk. Many immediately noticed that the signs of it suggesting that it was staged. If this really was a fake, how could Zelensky decide to engage in such deception on this scale at such a critical moment? And here's what Putin said. He said, I don't follow this too closely. Zelensky is an actor, after all, and a talented one. And I say this, without irony. We know that from his films in early years, so there's nothing unusual here. They say the city sign now looks completely different, but that is not the point. The sign itself is located at least a kilometer away from the city. So if Kupiansk were really under their control, why stand outside the doorstep? Go inside the house. Some female bloggers managed to slip through, and thank God that nothing happened to them, and they videoed it. But the sky was there is literally full of drones, both ours and Ukrainian, so it's impossible to approach the center of the city freely. The time will come when our troops finish destroying the encircled enemy grouped on the northern and eastern bank of the Oskol and then turn westward. As for all these staged acts or attempts to reclaim lost positions at all costs, as is happening now near Krasnoarmeysk, the enemy is achieving no success. The problem for them is that a result of the active and effective action of our troops, the enemy has suffered very serious losses in their strategic reserves, which are practically gone. This is a very significant factor that will push the Kiev regime toward resolving disputes and ending this conflict by peaceful means. And that was it on the war. So then they switched to the economy. And the moderator says, reserves are nearly gone and war is a heavy burden on their economy. The European piglets, she called them, continue doing everything they can to destroy the Russian economy. And under such conditions, are we even able to talk about economic growth here in Russia? And where are we growing and where are we not growing? And this was interesting when he said, as usual for such events, I brought a table with me, all open data sources showing what has happened in our economy over the past year. He said GDP growth this year is only 1%. But if we take the last 3 years, which is a fair calculation, the total growth amount was 9.7%. And over that same period, growth in the Eurozone was only 3.1%. The lower growth rate this year was a decision by the government and the central bank to control inflation, is what he said. The target was to reduce inflation. By year's end this year, it will be at 5.7 to 5.8%. So slowing growth is a conscious price paid to preserve economic quality and macroeconomic stability. Then he talked about wage growth. He talked about debt. And he said the debt was important to me. So the deficit was 2%. And next year it'll be 1.6%. And over a 3-year period, it hasn't exceeded 1.5%. State debt is extremely low. And this is higher than it has been in other years that I have seen. 17.7% of GDP, and it won't exceed 20% in the coming years. And for comparison, France's public debt is around 120%, and its budget deficit is 6%. And the U.S. is far greater. The key achievement is that the budget has been balanced at a quality level comparable to 2021. So we meet all of our social obligations, develop national projects, pursue technological development, and ensure the needs of the armed forces. This demonstrates stability of the economy and finance under the control of the government and the central bank. So then he wanted to talk about Brussels, or the moderator did anyway, in stealing the money. And she said, they're trying to seize Russian assets. And he goes, theft is not the right word. Theft is secret. He said, what they are attempting is open robbery. And why is it failing? Because the consequences to the robbers could be very severe. One idea is to issue loans secured by our assets, but issuing loans increases public debt of the issuing country. So these obligations must appear in national budgets. France has already 120% public debt and more obligations. We'll see what happens then, because remember, I'm pointing this out because Macron is not very well thought of. His likability rating is like 10%. It's pretty bad. And so many countries store their reserves in Brussels and in these companies, especially oil-producing states. And these oil-producing states are watching, and doubts are rising. So once such a precedent is set, it can be replicated under any pretext. Today, the pretext is Ukraine. Tomorrow, it could be values, ideology, or cultural policy. This threatens the foundation of the global financial systems. And whatever they steal, one day they will have to return it. We will defend our interests, including in courts, seeking jurisdictions independent of political pressure. So these were pretty good answers that he was given, and it's one story, and it's so different from what we saw in the European summit, or the EU summit last week, which was really, we're going to get that money for Ukraine any way we can, and we're going to agree. Remember Ursula von der Leyen said we're not going to leave until we have the money for them. That's what she said. The summit will continue until we have the money for them. And they were thinking that there was only two ways to get it. Either steal the Russian money and convince Brussels to give it up, or figure out a way to loan it to them. And they figured out a way to loan it to them because the stealing of Russian money is probably not a good idea politically, economically, legally, at all. It's bad news. So then they got into science and research infrastructure. And a journalist from Novosibirsk said, Novosibirsk is famous for Akadem Gorodok, which means academy, the academy city. And with support from the country, construction of the Siberian circular photon source SCIF has begun. The facility is unique not only for Russia, but globally. And despite sanctions and economic pressure, it was built entirely with domestic production and will launch next year. How can we ensure that our young scientists stay in Russia? And Putin says, thank you for bringing this up. It is very good news. The idea arose during the Presidential Council on Sciences in Novosibirsk in 2018. And scientists from the Academy of Scientists and the Institute of Nuclear Physicists raised the need for this particle accelerator facility. There were delays due to sanctions, but the work has been completed, and this is a very big success story. And a similar system will be created in Vladivostok and in other regions. So it's important because it allows both fundamental and applied research in pharmaceuticals, new material, and much more. And he said, how do we keep our young specialists? First, infrastructure. True scientist is driven by work, by opportunity, wages, housing, quality of life, and we are in developing the entire system, grants, so-called mega grants, and they're talking about international infrastructure projects. And this focus on international infrastructure is a very big deal. We can't even put together here in the United States an infrastructure deal. We're so... all the money goes to the states, right? So you won't get... I mean, California has screwed up this rail, this high-speed rail. It's been screwed from the get-go, and they haven't built any, and all the money's gone already. And where did it go? And there's no national infrastructure movements because all the money goes to the states, and then it gets distributed through the political channels that way. And I don't know what the right answer is for us to do it. And there's, these national forms of movements. It's since there's only one government, and since we're a republic and we can't really do what we do, it'd be like, it seems to be similar, the high-speed rail projects, but they have that in the Eurozone. Some of the high-speed rail is funded through their euro. And I wonder, we have a federal highway system, but the money goes to the states. If you drive through, for example, I like driving through Alabama. Alabama has great roads. Whatever happens there, they're taking the federal money and actually using it on roads. And if you go to some other states, you go down the road and you're going thump, 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 and you're hitting crappy roads. And trucks don't want to drive in the right lane. They want to stay in the left lane because the right lane is destroyed. And there's plenty of places where that takes place. And even in the international highway system, and if you've driven anywhere, this is true. And, there's the money goes down to the states. And so I don't know if we got to change our system or whatever. And the Russian system's far from perfect, too. The best roads I've been on in a long time were in Colombia. Those were fantastic. And then in Morocco, surprisingly, they had a great country system. I went all the way around the entire country of Morocco, and they had great highway systems. Now, I had some crappy roads and off places too, but you could get between anywhere you wanted to go. And so, infrastructure, they were talking about, they want to send their, trying to send children to school abroad. He wanted to combat that, and since it's become mostly impossible these days, that's talking about it. This journalist wanted to talk about another program that they had called Time of Heroes. It's a program to place veterans of the special military operation into leadership roles in the government. And Putin says, well, it only made sense. He participated purposefully in this movement. And he said, the veterans of the Great Patriotic War, World War II, that is, they returned from the front and achieved extraordinary success in science, education, culture. Many in of my own professors, he said, were war veterans. One had lost his legs but was a brilliant specialist. Why should today's fighters be any different? Look at Naran Alexievich. That's the guy who was talking about it first. He said, yes, doubts at first. One thing is fighting. It's another to manage an institution. But hundreds of thousands are serving, and not all want civil careers. But those who do have potential, and the state has to create opportunities for them. And he went on in that regard. And talked about the unity of the peoples of Russia. And 2026 is declared the year of unity, and they pursue the target of supporting culture and languages of Russia's peoples. Now, remember, Russia has some 15, 20 different languages in its borders, and Yakutia is developing, but also provide exceptional soldiers, and there's film, and he talked about film, traditional values, and blah blah blah. That was pretty good. He talked about, so then people started getting, they were talking about support for soldiers and families, and question was, you've said that supporting fighters is not a fashion trend but a duty. And while preparing for today's program, we did review a large number of appeals. There are noticeably fewer appeals from servicemen and their families than in previous years. And we know that work is being done by the Ministry of Defense, the Defenders of Fatherland Foundation, People's Front, named a bunch of places. But the problems do remain: delays in payments, paperwork, especially the search for missing servicemen. And she said many issues are now being resolved. And the moderator gave a bunch of examples. And there was a video appeal from the widow of a fallen soldier. And the video message was from a lady named Kristina Grebia from Novosibirsk. And she gave her name. She said, I'm the wife of a serviceman who was killed in the special military operation. We live in Novosibirsk. We have 2 children, 6 and 4 years old. To this day, we have not received the survivor's pension. We do not have official certificates entitling us to benefits. My husband died in January of 2024. The death certificate was issued on December 10 of 2024. It's now the end of 2025, and our pension has still not been paid. Can the processing of such cases be accelerated? Now, that's a hell of a long time, and this can't have been a comfortable question, and it sure didn't look comfortable, and he said, first of all, I want to apologize to you. I apologize for sluggishness of services that are supposed to handle such everyday matters. He said, I assure your case will be resolved quickly, but the problems do exist. Recently, Anna Tsivielova, the head of Defenders of Fatherland and Ministry of Defense, reported some other things to me. Unfortunately, coordination between the Ministry of Defense and the social services still doesn't function completely without error. Excess bureaucracy does exist. Documents may be lost between departments, and decisions will be delayed. In your case, with 2 children, these issues must be resolved without delay. And he says there's another problem of missing servicemen. This is clearly visible from the number of appeals we receive. What can be done? A central coordinating center for such searches for missing servicemen has been established, and there are dedicated units in the military grouping, so they got their problems too. Then there was requests for oversight, and he talked about that, and these were clearly uncomfortable questions for him. And then there's a huge problem, and this surprised me a little bit. I've heard about it before, because I read the newspapers over there, and I have heard about it, but they have a huge telephone fraud problem. And I think I've spoken about it here in the past, where there have been efforts from Ukraine to call, and I've told you about the ones, I think I said one even last week. There was a girl who was convinced to go pick up bombing things because they say that she has to, and that they work for the security services in Russia, and they got to go pick this up and drop it off here, and it turns out to be scammers, and this telephone fraud is a pretty big problem. And he wants to know, the number of these crimes have fallen, and the fraud is still there. And with the development of AI, criminals are only improving their methods. And he urges the citizens that the moment anyone starts talking about money or property, hang up immediately and don't say anything else. Resolve financial issues only in person with institutions that you actually know. And wow, this was a pretty big topic. Then they talked about taxes and small business, and there were some uncomfortable stuff. My point in bringing this out to you, because they talked about culture, cinema, national narratives, and culture, efforts and censorship. Some argue that culture today is overly regulated. Where is the line? And he said, no one's creativity is prohibited, but when public money is used, society has the right to expect its basic values are respected. It's not censorship, it's accountability, he says. Now, I'm not positive I agree with all of that, but it didn't go far enough into it for me to get it. But he talked about personal connections and the memory of how a child sees how the family honors its elders, that type of thing, and how schools tell the stories of a local hero, or how films honestly portray sacrifice. That he's talking about a collective memory. And it was very interesting to hear this. And I don't know. He said, the journalist's last question was, well, it really wasn't the last question, but it's the last one I'm going to talk about. Said that on immigration, leaving the country, many people left Russia in recent years, and some are returning. What is your attitude about this? And he said, we've never closed the door. He said, people leave for many reasons: career, curiosity, family. He said, but Russia is not hostile to those who left. Those who return and want to work, they are welcome. What matters is not where you were, but what you intend upon your return. And so, they were talking about this because one of the troubles that they have over there is growth, and the growth of the family. He talked at length about the benefits that they give to families. So there's payments for having children. A large family, you get a larger payment, and they're pretty serious payment issues. There's a lot of money that is spent on that. And the reason I spent so much time on that is because of the I don't know. It seems like when somebody is willing to sit for that long and answer questions, you could argue that, you get, Russian propaganda, misinformation, disinformation, whatever you want to call it. But, and I don't call it that. I say it's a guy connecting with the people. They focus a great deal upon the youth. They don't believe, and I'm going to switch into the Jeffrey Sachs and the rewritten history, of what has happened since the 90s and all of that makes this type of discourse so important, and at least in my view, because it doesn't happen in other places. It doesn't even happen here as much as it needs to. Here we got people who won't explain anything. They don't explain a damn thing. They go do what they're gonna do. You get into office, and then all your only job is to stay there, and you do that by keeping quiet. Unless you got gold to be the president yourself, then you make sure to stay on top of the scam, of what is going on. And I'm not saying it's any different in Russia. I don't know. I don't live there, but it's but I do pay attention, and the differences to me are striking in at least the way that people speak. Putin's got a pretty big percentage of people that trust what he is doing over there, and the people in general are. I don't even want to say that it's they're all for it, but they certainly understand it, and they know what they are fighting for. They are fighting for their own country. And we've gotten so far away from fighting for our own country, and we're on some global dominance thing. At least it appears in my lifetime to have been this global dominance thing, that we're forgetting what's important. And what's important is the basis of what we are accomplishing here, and what we want to leave to our children here. Does it matter if we take over the world for our children? No. It matters what we leave them here, and we leave it in a better condition than when we took it over from our parents. And I'm not so positive that's the case. I'm really not. I hope that the old Trumpster is helping us change this. But if you don't understand your past, how can you figure out where the hell you're going? And we've destroyed the past for the last 20 years here, maybe longer. And, I like to watch Jeffrey Sachs, if you pay attention to me at all. And I think the guy, he had another, he gave another assessment here recently. I want to talk a little bit about the broken promises of history, recent history. Why does 1990 still matter? So if Putin is right that responsibility begins way before 2022, he is, by the way, who broke the chain first? So Jeffrey Sachs talks about the German reunification, where Germany promised that if they were allowed to reunify, they wouldn't expand. That's it. The West Germany had obviously NATO. And there were talks then that, we'll get rid of the Warsaw Pact. We'll get rid of it. But we don't want NATO expanding this way. And we had promises from a lot of people, from the German chancellor, I forget his name at that time, and from Bush 1 at that time, that said, not 1 inch eastward. NATO expansion since that time, it's like 9 times or something like that. And Poland, all the Baltics, Georgia, and Ukraine are predictable flashpoints, according to Sachs. Well, according to me, too. If you're going to go into Georgia, that's bad news. If you're going to go into Ukraine, that's a clear red line. And that's all we've been trying to do, is create coups in there through all of our shenanigans around there. And so when you listen to people like Jeffrey Sachs, he's pretty blunt about it. And Solovyov, who I like to watch, he's quite accusatory, and he's pretty sharp, and he doesn't argue whether the promises were broken. He says the West doesn't even pretend those promises exist anymore, or existed ever. And he calls it erasing history, laundering the narrative, and infantilization of the public, turning the public into a bunch of babies, who don't pay attention. And so how do you tie this to Putin? What Sachs explains academically, Putin has answered politically. And Solovyov, he indicts people for it. Putin says we have to discuss the root causes. Solovyov says the West refuses to say what the root causes are, that those things don't exist. And Sachs says, but they were documented in real time. And so when you have all these people, all 3 of them are correct, by the way, this is why you hear that these explanations never reach audiences in the West. I mean, how long did it take people after 2022 from waving their Ukrainian flags all over the damn place to understanding that there was even another side of the story? There's plenty of that going on, right? Nobody knew. And some people have still got their heads buried in the sand and don't want to believe it. Oh, geez, you're Putin apologist. No, I'm a realist is what I am. And there are plenty of realists out there now, but there weren't many of us in the beginning because people, you never heard the story of it. Hell, we didn't even know. I wouldn't say we, because I certainly knew, but people didn't know that this had been going on in the Donbass since 2014. That the coup even occurred, that Crimea wasn't the issue that everybody said it was. nonsense. And so, what is how do we combat this seriously? So let's go on to another core question of all of this nonsense and all the people that are talking. Is this $90 billion $90 billion euro panic all over Western Europe, and Russia's claim that you better not steal our money because everybody's watching. Putin's saying, look, they're watching you in Riyadh. They're certainly paying attention in the global south. But all these oil countries are paying attention because where do we keep our money? Where do people keep their state assets? More and more of them are switching to gold, right? And he says, steal from us. That means you'll steal from anybody if they cross you. That's how the system works. If you're in the West, if you don't, kiss our rear ends politically or agree with us politically, we'll take your stuff financially. We'll just take your stuff. So the EU and its 90 billion euro loan to Ukraine is because of its failure to seize Russian assets. They were scared off of that. Now, that doesn't mean they're not going to continue along that front and still try to steal them somehow. But so far, the legal and debt constraints in Brussels have kept them off of it. And, this is just political theater for everybody out there for how to steal it. And, Solovyov goes right for the guts here. He says, the EU is afraid of setting a precedent. They're afraid of courts and afraid of its own citizens. And they're trapped by their own rules-based order because now people are starting to go, well, there are no rules. So how is this a rules-based order? And, he mocks, he's mocking them, just like I do. Everybody's mocking them because it's nonsense. They say this is about values, core values, Western values, but they don't explain who pays the money. And so what did Putin say about this? We saw it. He says, we're trying to keep a balanced budget, low debt, courts about not seizing our money, and long-term trust in currency has to exist. So Putin spends hours explaining where the money is, where it goes, why does it matter. It spends 4.5 hours talking about it, and in Brussels, they just throw out this 90 billion and hope nobody asks, where's this coming from? Because it's coming from their own funds. Germany can't afford this. They're losing their butts, and their economies are tanking. Nobody's is booming. Well, that's not true. India and China are doing pretty well. And Russia isn't stagnant. I mean, they got some growth. We're doing pretty well, right now under the Trumpster. That's true. So Putin's explaining where the money is, where it goes, why does it matter, and that, is important. And that's why these narratives are so important and the questions that people ask. So while the West is arguing, about this, how do we steal money versus should we steal the money versus, what about our rules-based order? The rest of the world is watching closely because the alignment is, I'm telling you, if the West is consumed by Ukraine, who is shaping the rest of the board? I mean, seriously, who is? Is it China and Latin America? Who's building infrastructure, ports, rail, energy, right? Rubio, in his own press conference this past weekend, he made accidental admissions that, the global south is watching this asset seizure. He talked about it. And he talked about China in South America. And Solovyov says, Ukraine is only a strategic distraction. That's what it is. He says, the U.S. is stuck refereeing Europe's unresolved war psychology, and China is building. And they're building in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, and they're choosing delivery of infrastructure, delivery of capacity, industry, over moral lectures, which is what we've done for forever. We morally lecture them about connect with us, buy from, and then we go steal their resources. I shouldn't say we. I should say the same old elitists make the same old money, and that's. Tell you what. So the Putin presser and the accountability and everything he put together, 4.5 hours. We hear one leader answer questions with no filter. And then, I don't know, that kind of being put under the gun is, well, it's interesting to see. It's very interesting to see. And, I want to contrast that with what nonsense we have going on in the EU right now, right? We have, get this. So a court has forced Kaja Kallas to get this. This is an interesting story. The EU foreign policy chief Kaja Kallas was forced by the court to publicly retract false statements that she made about an Estonian opposition politician. In a social media post in February of 2022, Kallas, Estonia's prime minister at the time, and now she's EU foreign representative, claimed the police were attacked at a protest that was organized by the other side and the Foundation for the Protection of Family and Tradition that he headed. So she linked the same guy to COVID-19 restrictions rallies, and she was sued. She got sued in 2022, and they sued her saying her claims had no factual basis. And last year, an Estonian court ruled in their favor and found that no police were attacked at rallies organized by either of these parties, and neither were linked to this demonstration. So earlier this week, the Estonian Supreme Court declined to hear her appeal and made the ruling final. And here's what she had to post. On Saturday morning, here's her post. I, Kaja Kallas, published false factual claims in a post on February 17, 2022, stating that Estonian police were attacked at a demonstration organized by Varo Vugled and SAPTK in Toompea, and that Varo Vugled and EKRE organized a demonstration on October 23, 2021 at Freedom Square in Tallinn. These claims are untrue. She did not apologize to either plaintiff. But she did put her post out as she was ordered to by the Supreme Court. She has faced repeated criticism over the accuracy of her public statements. She recently claimed that Russia invaded at least 19 countries over the past 100 years, none of which ever invaded or attacked Russia, a claim that is absolutely false. The remark was later echoed by Finnish Foreign Minister Elina Valentin, led Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman Maria Zakharova to accuse Western Europe of deliberately promoting the inept and uneducated to top government posts. Separately, Kallas expressed surprise to learn that Russia and China defeated fascism in World War II, calling that something new. This comment prompted Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov to suggest that she should study history, which she clearly does not excel. She's not very bright. Kallas has also faced growing criticism for her hardline approach to foreign policy and hawkism against Russia. Analysts and EU officials have accused her of favoring confrontation over diplomacy. The Czech newspaper HN reported this month that her work style is increasingly seen as unproductive. I found that comical. Let's see, what other news did we have that was that I wanted to get to today? Witkoff called the talks with Putin's envoy over the weekend productive. So Russia is committed to achieving peace in Ukraine. Steve Witkoff described the latest negotiations in Miami with Kirill Dmitriev as productive and constructive. In a statement posted Saturday, Witkoff said Dmitriev held meetings over the past 2 days in Florida with an American delegation, including Witkoff, Donald Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner, and White House official Josh Greenbaum. The discussions were aimed at advancing Trump's peace plan for Ukraine. Russia remains fully committed to achieving peace in Ukraine, Witkoff wrote, adding that Moscow highly values the efforts and support of the United States. And so, Kirill Dmitriev wrote, "Thank you, Miami," and posted he's got an interesting post on X that shows "next time in Moscow" shirt. The talks with Dmitriev took place in separate rounds of meetings involving Ukraine and its Western backers. According to Witkoff, the Ukrainian delegation spent 3 days in Florida holding consultations. The discussions include American representatives and key European national security advisors. No result and no discussion about that. This brand new news here, a car bomb killed senior Russian general in Moscow. So Russian general killed in a car bomb blast. He was identified as Lieutenant General Fanil Sarvarov, head of operational training at the General Staff College. According to the statement, an explosive device was planted beneath the vehicle he was traveling in and detonated on Monday morning, southern part of the Russian capital. The blast damaged several other vehicles. And this is the second bomb. Last December, a bomb hidden on an e-scooter killed Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov, commander of Russia's nuclear, chemical, and biological defense forces, in a Ukrainian plot. So, I think this is important here. China set a new monthly record. Purchasing what? China bought a record amount of gold from Russia in November, with shipments rose to almost 1 billion. Russia's gold sales to China valued at $961 million in November, following October's total of $930 million, as Moscow steps up efforts to reroute precious metal exports away from Western markets. In October and November last year, Russia did not ship any gold to China, and its previous peak was just 223 million. Over the first 11 months of 2025, Chinese imports of Russian gold were $1.9 billion. Wow, that's a big deal. Russia and China have intensified cooperation since February 2022. That's true. Where's this other story I wanted to get to? Nope, I already read that one. Where'd it go? Damn it. Let's see here. Here it is. Zelensky admits that Ukraine cannot afford an 800,000-man army. Ukraine will not be able to afford maintaining an 800,000-man army after the end of the conflict, Zelensky admitted, saying he wants Western aid to help finance the military as part of post-conflict security. In January 2025, Now, I don't believe this number. Zelensky said the Ukrainian army numbered 880,000 troops. However, leaked versions of a U.S. peace roadmap floated last month called for the force to be capped at 600,000, and some said that number was only 400. Kiev and its European backers have argued that Ukraine needs a larger military to deter this presumed Russian threat. Remember, Russia's taken over the planet, according to EU officials, a claim Moscow dismisses as nonsense. Speaking to reporters on Saturday, Zelensky was asked whether Kiev would be able to support 800,000 active servicemen when the conflict is settled. Will Ukraine be able to independently finance such an army if there's a ceasefire? He said, "No, it won't. We don't have the financial resources," Zelensky said. "That is why I'm holding talks with Western leaders, because I view partial funding of our army by our partners as a security guarantee." Kiev's European backers spent weeks searching for ways to fund the collapsing economy of Ukraine and the collapsing military. This week, they failed to approve a reparations loan backed by Russia's frozen assets. So they're loaning the 90 billion euro, which is $105 billion, over the next 2 years, and shifting the cost to their own taxpayers. Senior EU officials told Politico the loans would cost taxpayers $3 billion a year in interest as long as the loans are outstanding. Russia has accused Kiev's European backers of prolonging the conflict, and they are obsessed with finding more money to continue this war. They've been talking about elections also. And, you know, Ukrainian leader Zelensky is contradicting himself by saying he would not allow outside interference in elections while simultaneously seeking Western involvement. His term expired over a year and a half ago. So there's a huge discussion on this topic by all sorts of political people, because earlier this month he said he was prepared to hold elections, but only if Ukrainians' Western backers guarantee their security. Vladimir Putin said Moscow will consider halting deep strikes on Ukraine on election day, but here's the caveat. The millions of Ukrainians living in Russia are allowed to take part in the elections. Ukrainian leader said in a post on X on Friday that he discussed the issue with the U.S. officials and expects Washington to impose a ceasefire to ensure safe elections. So Peskov said, he's a Kremlin representative, said, Zelensky is contradicting himself. He says that he would not let anyone interfere, would not let Putin interfere in the elections, yet he appeals to the Americans, so he doesn't object to interference by the Americans. Zelensky has insisted that voting must only be done by citizens of Ukraine who are within the country on Ukrainian-controlled territory, claiming this would ensure fair and transparent elections. While he acknowledged that there is also a practice of voting abroad, he said nothing about residents of Donbass, which Kiev still claims is its territory, or the millions of Ukrainians living elsewhere in Russia. Now, that number, they claim, is 10 million that have left Ukraine for Russia. And there's similar amounts. I mean, over here, we estimate some 400,000, I believe. And there's a similar, there are a couple million in, well, I don't know the exact number in Europe, but it's a large number. And so, I don't know how they do these elections, but it's the same old, How do we control it? We don't know. Interesting times, however. And And the Coast Guard is reportedly in active pursuit of another vessel. The U.S. has attempted to intercept a third oil tanker linked to Venezuela, with the Coast Guard in active pursuit, they say, in international waters. The U.S. official claimed the ship is sailing under a false flag and is subject to a judicial seizure order, and describes it as part of Venezuela's dark fleet, they call it. The vessel has not yet been boarded, but if it is successful, the operation will be the third such vessel seizure since December the 10th, when the U.S. forces seized the tanker Skipper, followed by another vessel, the Centuries, on Saturday. So the latest seizure comes just days after Trump announced a total and complete blockade of oil tankers. Officials have yet to identify this vessel, but according to media reports, the tanker being chased is the Bella 1, which was previously sanctioned for transporting Iranian oil. U.S. officials said the ship refused to submit to boarding and continued sailing, prompting what one official says is an active pursuit. The escalating seizures are part of Trump's broader pressure campaign against Maduro. Yes, I disagree with these things. Let's see. There were new details. Do you remember me telling you about the Louvre heist that happened? That chainsaw thieves stole over 8,000 gemstones in a carefully planned heist at this museum. So this happened. When did that actually occur? It was back in October, I want to say. And it says the haul from the daylight heist at Paris's Louvre Museum in October has been valued at about 88 million euro or $96 million, with thieves making off with gemstones set into French crown jewels. 4 masked men armed with chainsaws broke into the museum on October 19th, went to the Apollo Gallery. They cut open a display case and fled with the jewelry pieces. And the heist lasted only minutes and was conducted with no one being injured. 8,482 diamonds were stolen, 35 emeralds, 34 sapphires, and 212 pearls. So they were mounted in 8 jewelry pieces that were part of a temporary exhibition on loan to the museum. The investigators believe the thieves targeted the items for the value of the stones rather than the artistic significance of the jewelry. Police say the operation was well planned. 2 suspects entered the gallery while 2 accomplices waited outside to assist in the escape. They fled using scooters and abandoned equipment used to reach the display. They later determined the vehicles linked to the getaway had been stolen and altered to avoid detection. CCTV footage and evidence reviewed allowed police to retrace the suspects' movements before and after the robbery, and they believe much of the preparation and escape was coordinated from a suburb north of Paris, where multiple vehicles were seen leaving and returning in tightly choreographed sequence. The van believed to have been used has not been recovered. 2 suspects were later detained and admitted their involvement. One of the men, 34-year-old Algerian, reportedly said he was a delivery driver. The second also worked in delivery. The Louvre, which is home to the Mona Lisa, has long faced scrutiny over security and modernization delay. Yeah, the jewelry has not been recovered. Investigators say it remains unclear whether the gemstones were removed from their settings, sold, or hidden. We do not know. Isn't that crazy? You want to hear some more international stuff? Denmark is slamming the completely unacceptable Trump move. You know, the U.S. president has appointed a new envoy to Greenland. We haven't heard anything about this in a while, have we? That we're taking over Greenland. And he said he will make Greenland part of the United States. So Copenhagen is expressing outrage over President Trump's announcement of the new special envoy to Greenland. On Sunday, Trump stated on his Truth Social account that Louisiana Governor Jeff Landry is now going to be the special ambassador to the island, explaining that he understands how essential Greenland is to our national security. Landry confirmed the appointment on a post on X, saying he will work to, make Greenland part of the United States. So the Danish Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen said the development came out of nowhere and is completely unacceptable. Isn't that funny? According to remarks cited by Television 2, his department will summon the U.S. ambassador in Copenhagen to demand explanations. Greenland Prime Minister Jens Frederik Nielsen said the U.S. move doesn't change anything for us at home, and the island still belongs to its people. Trump's interest in acquiring Greenland from Denmark dates back to his first term, but has also featured in his international rhetoric since returning to White House in January. And he has not ruled out annexing the island. U.S. has maintained a military presence on the strategically important island since World War II. Vice President J.D. Vance visited the U.S. Space Force base on the northwest coast of Greenland in March. He noted that while the U.S. was not likely to use force to seize the territory, it remained open to locals exercising their right to self-determination and breaking away from Denmark and joining the United States. So self-determination counts in Greenland, right? But not in Ukraine, not in Donbass, does it? Not in Crimea. Oh, no. They can't self-determine, right? Oh, Trump is purging Biden-era diplomats in a global recall. That was an interesting deal. It's a short story, so I'll share it with you. Oh, you know what? I don't think I'm going to have time. I'm running out here. But he's recalling more than 24 career diplomats from posts worldwide, the AP said. The move comes as part of a sweeping reshuffle under his foreign policy efforts. Africa has been the most affected with recalls in 13 counties, including countries. Jeez, why am I losing it today? Because I slept about an hour last night. I don't know why. But it goes in fits and starts. I never sleep. It's ridiculous. But Africa has been most affected. 13 countries, including Nigeria, Rwanda, Somalia. Asia has 8 countries, including Philippines and Vietnam. 4 European states, Armenia, Macedonia, Montenegro, and Slovakia, and along with 2 each in the Middle East and the Western Hemisphere. Politico said targeted diplomats were not given reasons for their recall. Asked for comment, the State Department said the recalls were standard process and declined to give details, but stressed that ambassadors are the president's personal representative and it is his right to ensure they advance his agenda. So the recalls come amid broader shifts in U.S. foreign policy under Trump. He has also overhauled trade policy and what he calls reciprocal tariffs. Yeah. Interesting times. Trump is trying to divorce himself, from NATO, filing for divorce. Divorce is so messy. And we shall see what comes of it when these things develop. I appreciate you joining me this Monday morning and International Flavor live from the Lake Ozark Real Estate of the Art Studio, and listen to me babble on and on this morning. You can listen to damradio.com/live, and I like it when you do, as does our illustrious and fearless group of folks that give content on this show. Today, at 2 p.m., we have JR's Really Big Shoe. 4 p.m., we have Search for Solutions. And at 6 p.m., Jack's Car Show. Thanks for being with me today, and have a very good day.
Damn Radio.